All right, let's kick off. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, New Board Members, the First 100 Days. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next 40 or so minutes. Now, during our session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or simply just use the chat if you're a bit easier with that. And we'll answer as many of these questions as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the very end, which we hope you do, and as is usual for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a quick 1-minute survey, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper from our friends at Taken Care Of, worth over $400. Now, for those of you who don't know BoardPro, we're a board software provider that serves over 15,000 users around the world. We enable organizations to run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with less time and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we're a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints, hence why we host these information-based webinars for you. So let me introduce you to our host and panelists today. Our host is Stephen Bowman. He's Managing Director of Conscious Governance. He brings a depth of experience with board reviews and strategic planning. And Stephen has a wealth of executive governance experience and has written, believe it or not, over 14 books on governance and strategy. Good afternoon or good morning to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Sean, and welcome everyone.
Chris Ridd has nearly 30 years experience in the IT industry. He led Xero's expansion into the Australian market from a small startup to become one of the largest online cloud software companies. God, that's a mouthful. Growing from around 7 staff and 4,500 customers to over 270 odd staff and 320 paying customers. Good afternoon to you, Chris. So Brett is the co-founder and CEO here at BoardPro. Brett's a serial entrepreneur, having built several high-growth businesses over the last 15 to 20 years. Good afternoon to you, Brett.
Kia ora and hi, everyone.
So for the next 45 minutes, just relax, listen and add to the discussion by asking the many questions that we hope you do. The full recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck, the white paper, and the board induction checklist, which you'll learn about shortly, will be sent to you at the conclusion of today's webinar. So, Stephen, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Why, thank you, Sean. So today's conversation we want to have with you is about the first 100 days, but it's a bit of a misnomer as a title, because really the sort of work we should be looking at as directors is even before our first 100 days. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that as to about preparing for your first board meeting, and then what do we do over the next series of time. So really what we want to talk about is this notion of induction and getting yourself ready for coming on to this particular board that you're looking at joining. And one of the things that we find is that many organizations really don't have good induction programs. Typically, it's here's a bunch of papers, good luck, see you at the first board meeting, have fun reading them. So what we want to do is to take it to the next level where our new directors coming on, no matter how inexperienced or experienced they might be, they're able to add value from day one. And that's really what we want to talk about today. How do we add value from day one and continue to add value as directors? So any good induction program, there's 4 key elements always, and we find that this is missing from many of them. The 4 key elements are, number 1, it's mandatory. I don't care how experienced you are as a director, you have to go through an induction program. Now that means that it better be a good induction program. So it's mandatory, everyone needs to go through it, and it's managed. The second element is it should be formally monitored. It has to live somewhere. Gone are the days where we just send out a big email with a whole lot of attachments to it. Usually the monitoring is done by the governance committee, where they will actually monitor whether or not the induction is meeting its mark, ongoing with that new director, checking in with the mentor to make sure things that are happening. So formally monitored and also reviewed. So every year there should be a review of how well did our induction program enable our new director to actually really add value. The third major element is the mentors or the buddy system. Many of you may have come across this, but there's a couple of issues with it that I found in over 90% of boards. Firstly, it's not mandatory, so you do it if you feel like it. And secondly, the mentor is usually only assigned for maybe 2, 3, 4 board meetings. So what we have found, and directors have told us, is that you assign mentors for 6 months, and then for the next 6 months, a second mentor, a different person. And the reason for that is what you don't know in your first 6 months is very different to what you don't know in your second 6 months. And so we need to pick up on that. And then the other part is mandatory, monitored, mentoring, and at least 12 months duration. So that means that we need to actually plan our induction out so that it's not all crammed into the first 2 months and there's no follow through with that. So just to think about that in terms of the 4 critical elements. Now, what's missing from this, and I'm going to call on Chris to talk about this briefly, is what about before the board meeting? What about before we actually turn up to our first board? What are some of the things we can do there? Chris, over to you. Unmute.
I'm sorry, because I'm at home, I don't want dogs barking in the background. But yeah, look, it's a great question. So my background's mainly commercial boards. I was just having a look at some of those poll questions. We've got a lot of people from not-for-profit. And I think, look, you made a really good point to start with, Steve, about what happens prior to. And I like to refer to T-100 days, which is doing your own due diligence before you join a board. Certainly, it's something that I've done in the commercial space where I might spend 3 months consulting to a board. You know, I know there's a lot of people out there that have probably joined not-for-profit boards based on, you know, a real purpose and getting involved and actually giving back to something. And it's, you know, it pays to get to know the organisation. You know, you might want to come in as, you know, shadow director type role to do some consulting just to get a real feel for the dynamics. Because, you know, boards are hard in some senses in that, unlike in an organisation where you're in there day in, day out, you can build strong connections with a team. You're only meeting 6 to 10 times a year. So the dynamic of actually how to build the connections with a team become more challenging. So it does pay to get to know the people you're going to work with, because let's face it, it's a team environment and teams work better when there's great, strong, you know, there's strong dynamics. So that is something that I think is definitely worth considering.
So one of the things we wanted to do with this is to give you an indication of what it is that not only can we do as an organisation to develop up really good induction programs, but as a new director, what can I do? Because one of the things that we find often is a new director sees themselves as a recipient of information rather than a creator of their own induction program alongside what the organisation is providing. What you'll find is you'll get a white paper in here and there'll be a sample board induction program in there for you to look through, and there's a checklist that goes with it. We found this incredibly useful in all the boards I've been on and all the boards that we've worked with, but you'll get that as part of the white paper. But one of the first things that should be done is not just giving your new director a list of material, but actually sitting down and developing up the content of your induction program so it covers off on the main key areas. Also, as a new director, you have the responsibility of making sure you're getting what you require as a new director, not just assuming that the organisation or the board that you're joining has their act together when it comes to good induction. And I say that with a lot of knowledge because we do many, many governance reviews. And one of the most interesting, consistent comments coming through is, I think we had an induction program. I'm only 12 months on the board, but I'm not sure that it actually really added value to what I was doing. And this is coming from corporate and non-profit boards as well. So as a director, what I'd like each of us to consider is how do we actually use the material that we're being sent? Because, you know, typically you'll get a whole wad of material, you know, including the strategic plan. But the key thing here is I see the strategic plan, I'm reading, what do I do with it? How do I use that? How do I actually read and understand my organization's strategic plan so that in my first board meeting, I can actually ask really good questions? So one of the things always is not just to receive the strategic plan, but to understand what are the key strategies and look to see the board pack that you've been sent previous to you joining your first board meeting, to see how they're using the strategic plan to actually help shape conversations. It enables our new director to actually be strategic with the framework of the strategic plan from their very first meeting, if they understand what it is and actually start to use it to help shape what they say and the questions they ask. Brett, what's your view on that?
Oh, I just wanted to jump in there, Steve, and we were talking and when we were preparing yesterday, and this is a little bit of a shameless plug for board software, including BoardPro. So a modern board software platform will give the incoming board member the ability to pick and choose topics and type in search queries and search back on all minutes, actions, agenda items, documents. So, taking your example, you could literally say, hey, these guys have articulated their top 4 strategic priorities. Let's go for a search and see over the last year, what have they actually done? What records, what minutes, what actions are available in the system? I think you did something like that, didn't you, Chris, when you were doing your induction for BoardPro?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, we have obviously a bias towards having good software that can do that, but the ability to go back over a few years to look at board papers, you get a sense as well as to how the board's functioning, because if there's ongoing issues that are not being resolved, and sometimes you see that with something that's been kicked down the road, you start getting a sense of how that dynamic's working, or whether there's issues with the board. In fact. But I think it's so important to go back over and have a look at some of those previous board papers. And quite often we know they're sitting in email, but the more you can actually inform yourself based on past history, you can come into the meeting much more informed and ready to contribute.
One of the things that I'd recommend everyone look at is to, when as a new director, have your strategic plan on one side of your table, have the last board pack on the right and the other side of your table, and map them to see whether you can see from the board pack, is the material you're getting just a bunch of issues, or is it within the framework of strategy? And that immediately you can start looking at how the board is structuring its material. And if it's a bunch of issues without the framework of the strategic plan about it, then maybe a little conversation you could have with the chair outside of the board meeting about, look, I'm not quite sure where all these things fit in. Have you considered actually aligning the key discussion points in the board pack actually with the strategic plan so that we know where they fit? So the second thing, go on.
Stephen, I have a question that's coming from Pam Alga.
Yes.
Question is, would you tie your induction review to the annual board evaluation if you haven't got a governance committee? And when we recruit, we set up a nominating committee but don't have permanent governance committees.
My view has always been you probably should have a permanent governance committee, because they've got the role of looking after the two most important elements, the greatest assets that your organisation has. And those two greatest assets, quite honestly, are the board and the chief executive. And they need to be managed, monitored, mentored, performance managed, both the board and the CEO. And to do that on an ad hoc basis probably isn't good enough these days. So I would be looking at, and I don't care whether you call it a nominations committee or whatever it might be, but it should have that purview of governance. Different topic for a different time, but your induction program needs to live somewhere, and it's best under a committee of the board that actually will review it to make sure that if it's in play, then it's actually functioning, and to monitor whether or not it needs to change. Chris,
Thanks,
your
Steve.
views?
No, that's fine. I agree with that.
Well, that was easy. Okay, looking at vision statements. I mean, many organisations will provide you with a copy of the vision statement, but I want to know as a new director, how do we use it? I don't want to have to memorise it. I want to know it so well because we use it in everything. So why don't we actually provide our new directors with examples of how we use our vision statement? The fact that it should be on every board agenda. It should be on every page of our board pack to remind our directors that we're not there to meet. We're not there to make sure that our staff are busy. We're there to create this vision through the work that we do. So how do we use our vision statement? One of the things that really good boards do, and very few do this, is that at the first board meeting where a new director has joined, they spend 15 minutes just exploring with each of the directors, what does the vision statement mean to you, John? What does it mean to you, Mary? What do these elements mean to you, Peter? So that they actually spend 15, 20 minutes talking about the vision statement, not to recraft it, but just to say, what does it mean to you as a director? That's a very simple way of actually getting the culture of the board where the vision and how we want to create the future is first and foremost from day one. But as a new director, I want to know how we use it. How can I use it? And I'll be using the vision statement as a new director to help craft how I ask questions or help shape the conversations that I want to have with the board.
Let me chime in there, Stephen. So I'm predominantly here from the CEO perspective. Most of my 15 odd years sitting on boards has been serving boards as the CEO. So I just endorse how powerful a solid vision statement is. So a high growth startup like BoardPro has all this natural enthusiasm from those that get involved and on the board. But we, about 18 months ago, crafted a stronger vision statement with involvement from the team. And I've seen that really powerful in that I'll be debating or dialoguing with a board member over some issue. And it's really powerful to go up to that higher level and say, hey, what are we really about? So for BoardPro, making good governance possible for everyone. It's a really powerful centering statement. You can often move past the sort of the lower level issues and get alignment very quickly with that reminder for that base purpose of the organisation.
Yeah, spot on, Brett, exactly. The other thing I would say, the key element in what we're talking about now is, please, as part of the first 100 days, don't just give your new director papers and maybe a few meetings with staff. Show them how we as a board use this stuff. You've got a strat plan, fine. How do we use it? We've got a vision statement, great. How do we use it? That's the bit that's missing from over 90% of all induction programs.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Steve, I think we've got to remind ourselves that we're there to serve a purpose, and I've been on boards where you do get bogged down in governance and compliance, and I have been on an ASX board, and there's a tendency to do that. So I agree with Brett's view that just keep coming back and reminding yourselves as a board, you're setting the vision, you have to keep coming back to your purpose, and so there needs to be that groundedness about what we're doing as a board.
But I just segue us just for a second. I'll actually expand this. I saw earlier in the polls that 3/4 of our attendees today are on organisations of 100 staff or less. And we've got a question here from Patsy, who should be involved in developing a vision statement. Could I start with you, Chris? You must have come on to a number of boards over the years where they just don't have a vision statement. Some of the things Stephen is talking about just don't exist. How have you approached the situation of building that base level infrastructure that Stephen is talking to today?
Well, I mean, you can't go past the fact that, in some senses, you've got to lean into the organisation and get a cross-section of people that are actually involved day to day. You want to reflect what's actually happening out with the customers. I think if a board does that in isolation, they miss some opportunities. I've often found, as either CEO or board director, that some of the best ideas, some of the best insights you gather are people that are actually in the coalface. And I think particularly the case with not-for-profits where, they're serving great purpose. I think it's got to be a collective effort from people that are actually in there day in, day out with their sleeves rolled up. And that sort of feeds into the vision of the organisation.
Oh, if I can just make a comment there, is developing up a vision statement shouldn't take more than about half an hour. Now, this goes against all conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says, let's have a 3-day live-in with a whole bunch of people and come up with the 5 words that we least disagree about. That's not a vision. What you're doing with a vision, two very simple questions. Takes you half an hour to work through it. The first question is, what difference do we want to make to the communities that we serve? What is this difference that we want to make? And then the next question is, so why is that important? And then the next question is, and so why is that important? Is that the difference that we want to make to the communities that we serve? Why is that important? That iterative process will get you very close to the vision statement, which should very simply be about what difference do we want to make to the communities that we serve. We may not get there this year, we may not get there in 30 years, but the journey is part of the process. But this is the difference that we want to make. How we get there will be through our strategic plan. The fact that we want to get there is the power of our vision statement. Anyway, that's again another topic for another day. So moving back on to how to use board policies. One of the things that we're often given is a series of board policies, but as a new director, I want to know, where are these board policies? I also will be checking that we've got the right ones in there. Over 70% of boards don't have the policies that they actually should have, either at law or that the board require to do its work. So I need to know whether or not this board I'm coming onto has the right sort of board policies, which means I need a policy register. So don't just give your new directors a series of policies, give them a whole policy register that shows which ones are board policies, which ones are operational policies. And then I want to know, how do we use them? Now, one of the most important things, financial reports. You'll all get financial reports. And as a new director, what I'm looking for in any financial report is the insight, the strategic insight that financial report gives to me. As a director, we shouldn't be that interested in the figures. We should be incredibly interested in what the figures mean. So therefore, our financial reports should focus on what these figures mean, not just give me a series of spreadsheets. So for example, profit and loss statement. I want to see very clearly what the variances are. What are the reasons for those variances, which then becomes the business drivers for the organisation. Here's what we thought would happen. Here's what did happen. Here's the difference between what we thought and what actually did. And here's the reason why we didn't quite get that one right. I need to understand that. And then as part of that, I need to know, what are the strategic implications for us going forward, not just in the next 3 months, but in the next 5 years. What are some of these strategic implications that our profit and loss is actually providing us? And then you get your balance sheet. Most directors, even accountants, don't know how to read a balance sheet because they look at the figures, but there's no inquiry about, well, so what? So what I'm looking for is the key ratios from my balance sheet. Are we solvent? Fine. But what is our solvency ratio? What's a good ratio? What's a bad ratio? What's the range of our ratio? What are we aiming for? And then what have we got? And then what was it like last year? These are the things that help me as a director get a sense immediately of what is happening within the organisation. And then cash flow is the other one. The cash flow, you've all heard cash flow is king. Without cash flow, then your P&L and your balance sheet really don't matter that much. So I want to know as a director, not just what our cash flow projections are. I want to see a 3-month rolling cash flow. I want to know what our next 3 months is going to look like. And in particular, I want to know that we've got in place a process that if our cash flow falls below a certain trigger point, we know what it is we're going to do to bring it back up again, so that we can never be surprised. So as part of this, key ratios are an important part. So I want to know dashboard reporting. Fantastic. I've seen some great dashboard reports as a new director, but what's missing is the so what. I've got the dashboard, but what do you want me to focus on? So what? What do you want me to do with this information? So that's what we need to start providing new directors, but actually every director themselves. Now, I'm going to pass over to Chris on this.
I think, so in my experience, Steve, typically people on boards are going to play different roles. And I totally agree. I think any director needs to be across some of those core ratios, but leaning in on numbers, and certainly someone like myself who has been around numbers, etc. But, I might bring some different skills, go-to-market skills, but I need to be across that. And this is an interesting segue into a question that's come up around quietly observing and learning versus actively questioning. How soon? It really depends. It's a great question, Cecilia. Often you will join a board because you bring a particular skill set. You should have the confidence, if you're joining a board with that skill set, to be active from day one. But it's really a test and see. I've joined boards before where you've got really strong personalities. And for me, I've probably held back in that first board meeting to check the dynamic. I'll come back to something I said a little bit earlier. It really pays to do some background research on the people on the board that you're joining. Understand what they're about, what is their domain expertise they're bringing, what are their potential motivations, right? Because, often you've got independent directors, you've got others that are shareholders that have particular skill sets. But make no mistake, you've joined a board for a reason. They've brought you on because you bring some value. So the sooner that you can get comfortable within that dynamic and start adding value, I think the better.
But I'll just add a CEO perspective to that, Chris, because I really like what you're saying. So as a CEO, you get board members come and go, and in a commercial SME organization with investor board members, you have some strong characters around the board table, and sometimes you really want a new board member to come in and provide some balance or some challenge, but you're also aware you don't want them to blow their reputation too fast. So you're very aware that, I agree with what you say, Chris. They need to sort of get the lie of the land, build some relationship, and kind of ramp up sometimes the pressure or their ability to make change, because they can get pigeonholed and dismissed if they run too fast.
Yeah, and equally, I've been on some boards where we've had some pretty fiery discussions, not BoardPro, of course, but another one. And we had a new director join, and actually as chair, I contacted them afterwards just to sort of explain some context, because I didn't want to scare them off. So look, we're dealing in dynamic environments where there's a lot of pressure at times, and you have to understand that there's going to be, passionate debate. And these are just the realities. I think one thing I would say about joining a board, I often speak to people about joining boards that there's sort of this passive side gig that they're going to do, and it's going to be nice and easy. Sometimes it's bloody hard work, right? You've got to, and you've got, as I said, you've got debate and other pressures that come with being on boards, because you're overseeing a company, and as Steve's pointed out, you've got some pretty serious director duties. So I'm not trying to put you off, but indeed, there are some things you need to come in with eyes wide open in terms of what's required.
And again, just adding on to all of that, I think one of the mantras that has been running through my head for the last 40 years about being a director, and I've been a director on the international and national and state-based boards, but the mantra that runs through my head is, my gift is my curiosity. My gift is not what I say. So what I'm looking at as a director is, what are the questions I need to ask that will actually give me clarity and the rest of the board clarity in a way that no one else could do. So people say, what should I say in my first board meeting? Well, probably the first thing that comes out of your mouth probably should be a question that is based around strategy or around risk or around something like that, not for information's sake, but to add another strategic element to the conversation. So if in doubt, ask a question, but before you ask a question, tap into the energy of being curious rather than trying to make a point. Sophisticated directors know when you're trying to, blow your own trumpet or prove someone else wrong through the question that you ask. What we're after is using questions to actually unlock wisdom of the rest of the board, but also unlock wisdom from myself. That's what a good question will do.
So speaking of questions, this is a good segue. We have a number of questions that have sort of come through here. Do you mind if we jump into those now, Stephen?
Go for them, Sean.
Okay, so the first two are from a few slides back, but that doesn't matter. Read the vision statement. Our organisation has a close relationship with a friends organisation, which is the major source of funding for the organisation. I'm a board member of. Should they be involved in drawing up a vision statement?
The vision statement is primarily the board and the senior executive having an idea of what is the difference that we want to make. It's not a collective town hall meeting exercise. Now, once you figure that out, then you work with your stakeholders to see that they understand the story and the promise of this organisation. There's no, vision statements made by committees aren't particularly useful. Vision statements that provide strategic focus is what we're after. And they provide strategic focus because we use them to help shape our decision making. We use them to help show the stories of what we're doing. And as Chris and Brett were saying, it grounds us in what we're doing. It's not a political exercise. Chris?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think it's definitely about adding value, and we want to avoid politics at all costs on boards. But the reality is sometimes that exists, but no, I agree. I think it's, questions can be so valuable in terms of being able to drive the right conversation. There's a question there about the executive as well, which Sean, I might just pick up on about what happens if you've got a strong executive. I think it's a fantastic question. And I like boards where executives feel, that they're part of the solution. It's not a kind of too much of a hierarchy thing. But I think these are conversations that potentially need to occur outside the board meeting so that protocols are observed. Because I think if executives are taking too much control, then the board's failing in its duty, right? I mean, it needs to be a partnership, but there needs to certainly be oversight from the board, and their role is critical in ensuring there's accountability and questions, etc. So that can't be compromised. But I do think there's a balance in terms of executives at time, leaning in and actually being really part of that. So, Steve, I don't know if you've got a view on that, but I know we need to keep moving on. We've got a lot to get through,
we do.
Could I jump in there and just say, look, we at BoardPro, we've been developing an idea that we would run some real life at board webinars, perhaps much more Q&A, into the gritty topics. I can see by the explosion of questions on chat and Q&A, we're just not going to get through everything in 10 minutes. I think we should park that. We've heard all of you. We'll take this on board and design a webinar that drills into some of these topics.
Yeah,
and I
good
think
idea,
we should
Brett.
Carry on with Stephen
and
get through the major material.
Okay, so I'll take that as let's move on, Steve, to let's have a look at the next one that we've got here is looking at risk management plans. Every organisation has some sort of risk management policy and a risk management plan. Most of them are rubbish. And the reason they're rubbish is because they've been developed by the staff, and the staff do a great job in managing risk. But no one has really figured out what the board needs to know about risk. So what I'm looking at as a new director is I want to know what are our top 3 or 4 key risks, and how are we looking at leveraging those risks? How are we managing them? How are we turning that to opportunity? And how are we actually creating revenue from actually knowing and understanding these top 3 or 4 key risks? That's what I'm excited about. Don't bore me with this huge spreadsheet of 451 risks on a risk register. So let's understand how we as a board understand risk and use risk as a strategic advantage conversation, not as a compliance issue. And you'll see in the white paper the various questions that we've provided that you can ask in your role as a new director. And for those of you who are developing up induction programs, answer these questions before the directors ask them. That would make sense. What are our top 2 or 3 risks? What's our risk appetite? So these are all things that we can actually develop up in advance of needing them as part of our induction program. Now, the 6th one is to look at the Constitution. The Constitution is the legal document. This is our contract that we have with society and our contract that we have with the various stakeholders. So as a new director, you should read it. But let's make it easy for our new directors and tell them what are the top 3 or 4 clauses they need to know. And there's just some examples of some of the clauses. But one of the things I found very useful is a 1-page summary of the 3 or 4 key elements that come out of the Constitution. So at the very least, if I don't read the whole thing, at least I've got a summary of what are the 2 or 3 key things that I do need to know about. Reminding directors of their legal responsibilities, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, but more importantly, some conversation about what that means in the context of this organisation. If we're in the critical metals sphere in a listed company, what does care, loyalty, and obedience look like in this area? If we're a disability organisation, what does care, loyalty, and obedience? That sort of conversation, really powerful to have. And then the next one is mentoring. Now, there were some great questions before about mentoring. My view is that the mentors probably should be directors as part of the board induction program, but you can also ask your new director maybe to look for an outside mentor as well too, but they choose that person. But looking at mentors, there's a way of doing it as opposed to just saying, have some buddies. So you can actually develop up some guidelines about how to actually mentor and provide your directors with advice on how to be a mentor, and then the mentees, which is a strange name, how to actually make the best use of the mentoring that they're being provided. So just to finish this off, there are 3 key areas that I really think that we need to focus on in the first 100 days. The first one is the T-100 days that Chris mentioned before. So do your due diligence. Learn about who your directors are. I've seen many examples where a really good director has actually taken out their new colleagues for a cup of coffee. The person who's not even joined the board at that stage, they've gone out to actually have a talk about, what are the things that I need to know about as a director that will help me in my first, 2 or 3 board meetings. And then as a director to follow up, as a new director, to follow up with your fellow directors over and above the mentoring. Most directors, unfortunately, see that their role is at the board meeting and anything else is I need to receive stuff and then I'll read it and then I'll get back, as opposed to managing those relationships. And I think both Chris and Brett have said one of the key things you can do is actually realise that a board is just a bunch of people. Get to know the people, and then everything else starts to work itself out. So,
Stephen,
make the most. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, Stephen. Should we try and get through a few more of these questions?
Sure can.
We've got, how long have we got now? We've got about 7 minutes remaining. So a question from Andrew Horn. Do you have any suggestions for managing new directors who represent a major shareholder or stakeholder with vested interest and ensure focus on acting in best interest of the company, not nominee?
Go, Chris.
Well, I think part of it is structurally to make sure that the board has a fair share of independent directors as well. Ultimately, the board is responsible for focusing on issues outside of potentially, directors that have vested interests or shareholdings. But ultimately, the board is accountable to shareholders. So you've just got to make sure it's aligned and there's a clear agenda and a focus on the issues that are really going to drive the business forward.
We have one from Paul Smith here.
Before we move on, just a couple of things to add to Chris. One of the greatest questions as a director that you can ask, whether you're a new director or an existing director, if you've got someone on your board who is very clearly thinking their role is to represent their sector or to represent WA or to represent this subsector, one of the best ways to get them back on track again and still have access to their representation is to simply ask them, what's the strategic issue behind what it is that you've just said?
Yeah.
What's the strategic issue behind what it is that you say is your point of view in this area? So that we start to get them to think outside of representation. Some people will never do anything but represent, but if you can ask them to get their conversation to the next level up, you can actually get value out of that. Chris?
Just on that too, sorry, Brett.
There you go.
Just remember, guys, that take the politics and the tension out of some of this stuff. I've been in situations where it's very clear that a director has a line of thinking and potentially is pushing a particular agenda. There's nothing wrong with having a conversation outside of a board meeting with a particular director if there's a concern there, and just making sure there's alignment, because those situations can be a bit tricky. And what you don't want is to have a flare up in a board meeting. So team dynamics, but there's also a case to be said that if there are those sorts of concerns, you can raise it with a chair or have a conversation with a director.
I have another question in from Kate Valentine.
Before we go on, Brett.
Go ahead, Brett.
I'll just quickly add to that. There's a good post on our blog. If you look up Blackmores on our blog, where we address the issue of a major shareholder. There was a well-publicised stoush between the founder of Blackmores, significant Australian company, and their board. It was all over the Australian media late last year. So if you have a look, we've got a blog there addressing, the gorilla in the room kind of scenario.
Yep.
Back to you, Sean.
Yeah, so we have a question in from Kate Valentine. Curious about community-owned organisations' boards can develop vision and purpose statements without meaningful consultation whilst maintaining credibility and connection. That's more of a statement than a question.
Yeah, okay. Meaningful consultation has its place. Of course you have meaningful consultation, but I wouldn't have the community develop up a vision statement. I would have the board and the senior executives develop it up and test it with the community to see how that works. But more importantly, to show the stories behind it. If we're out of touch with our community, then they'll be very upset with what we come up with. If we're not out of touch, then we'll actually be reflecting that as well. So it's not a group activity, in my view.
So we were talking about information on our blog. There's a really good blog article that Chris wrote. I think it was late part of last year, November, December, wasn't it, Chris?
Yeah.
I'll put this in the chat just now. If you just give me a second.
Hey, and I actually went back and had a look at that blog, and one thing I would also just add, and I think Steve, mentioned this. I think it's very important. One of the things that's really helped me as a director is to have external mentors. I've still got 2 mentors that have nothing to do with the boards I'm on, because it doesn't matter how experienced you are, you're always going to come up against things where you're kind of not really sure how to move forward. I get some fantastic advice outside of the boards. Obviously they're confidential relationships where, I can discuss openly some of the challenges. Very valuable. And, we're all on a learning journey. So, if you don't, it's just important to tap into your network and find people that, just over a coffee once every couple of months can be invaluable.
And that answers Ariana's question, how do you find an external mentor? Tap into your networks and ask.
Very good. Okay, so we're almost at the close of our webinar. We've got? A couple of minutes left. So please feel free to reach out and connect with Stephen, Chris, and Brett. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection on LinkedIn. Now, just as a reminder, we have some really interesting webinars coming up over the next couple of months. The first one here, creating the CEO report that will delight your board, creating effective minutes for your board meeting, and understanding the power of great board dynamics. So unless there are any other statements from you guys you'd like to make, we'll conclude today's session.
I'll just say again, Sean, there's a wealth of questions. Apologies, everybody, we couldn't possibly get through them in the 45 minutes, but we do like to stick to the program for this, but we'll certainly be reviewing this and looking at that, as I've said in a couple of the question answers, as to some deeper dive with some real life at boards webinars for you.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add is that, quite often here we're covering so much information and it can feel a little bit intimidating. My parting comment would be, being on a board is incredibly rewarding. It is something, and clearly there's a lot of people here on this call that are joining not-for-profit boards that are doing it because they've got great purpose and want to actually contribute. So we don't want to lose sight of that. This is about constant improvement, but, obviously, we don't want to intimidate, but just keep sight of the fact that they can be incredibly rewarding when you're actually steering an organisation or a not-for-profit to actually deliver fantastic outcomes.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. So you'll receive an email from us fairly shortly, which will include a video of today's webinar, of course, the presentation slides, the topic white paper, which Steve talked about, and also the induction checklist, which you can also download as a Word document. We'll also post this to our webinar page at boardprohub.com/webinars over the next couple of days. Now, just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey and go into the draw to win that hamper worth $400. We'll announce the winner fairly shortly after today's session. So thanks everybody for your attendance. Again, apologies for not being able to get through all the questions. We'll deal to that in a deep dive a little bit later on. Thanks guys for your input today, Chris, Brett and Stephen.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thanks everyone, bye.